Hey, 7th graders, Mr. Allard with another one of your flip lessons. Today we're going to be talking about the society differences or the social differences between the North and the South. You should have your spoke diagrams all set and ready to rock and roll in your numeric notebook. We've done a couple of them, so we should know how to do that as well. But if you have any questions on it, now would be the time to go to Schoology or go to one of your classmates and ask them. All right, here we go. Let's get after it. Just making sure I'm in the right track. All right, so society in the North. Society in the North, due to the economy that we were talking about, due to geography that we were talking about, northern geography, can't farm all year. Northern economy, working in factories. People were moving to the cities, so urbanization or the process of building cities was happening in cities across the North because that's where the factories were. Factories were there, they needed jobs, people were moving into the cities to do this in jobs. It was a slow process, but you got to think in terms of kind of how this looks. The numbers don't look huge, right? You're saying, oh, it's only 20% are in cities by 1860. That's up. That's 3 times as many people, and our overall population of the country is way bigger in 1860 than it was in 1820. So we're having more people in the North. More of those people are moving into cities. They're doing that because of jobs and factories are located in cities, because cities need to be near rivers, or the factories need to be near rivers, which many cities are built near, to produce their factories. Ooh, let me see where I can slide here. I'll go down here so you can get those notes real quick, and then I'll get out of the way. All right. Society in the North. Immigrants are coming to America and settling in northern cities. Again, not many immigrants are coming knowing the language and things like that, so they're coming for jobs. Lots of those jobs are in cities where the factories are, and they're offering those to whoever can fill it because the factories need workers. You can see by the maps, you can see by the charts, a lot of those folks are going to the North. In most southern states, except for I think Louisiana there, by 1860, only 10 to 20% of the total population is immigrants. Where we look at states like New York, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Minnesota, Wisconsin, those states have more than 20% of their population is going to be immigrants. Where are these immigrants coming from? They're largely coming from Ireland and Germany due to political, social, and economic issues happening in those two countries, and that's going to change a lot of what happens. During this time period, many of these folks are facing issues with, persecution and prejudice that we're seeing today when we deal with immigrants. This is not something new. This is something that has been part of our history ever since we kind of became a nation, because there has been immigration here, and a lot of the same issues that people had with the Irish and German immigrants 1820 1860 are a lot of similar issues people are having with Muslim or Latino immigrants in 2018. But they were settling in cities, they were looking for jobs, and they were mostly heading in the north, which is leading to that population growth and that urbanization. Cities in the north were not nice places to live. They were very dirty. You didn't have a sewer system. There were paved seats. There weren't paved streets. They were very crowded. This is before to their kind of people. Why would they do that? They didn't really know. They didn't know a lot of the things that we know today about cleanliness and how important it is with hygiene and creating people sick and disease and stuff like that. So again, you're a lot of these cities are filled with people who are new to the country. They need housing quickly as possible. They're just going to get what they can get, and there's not going to be a lot of complaints about it. But it was not a nice place to live. A lot of the things that we take for granted kind of today, trash collection, indoor plumbing, and that kind of stuff, they did not have those in cities in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, and it, with lack of a better term, it stunk. Literally, trash was on the streets. Somewhere in the neighborhood in New York City, many of the streets, we have primary sources that talk about, They didn't know if they were walking in mud or horse manure because it was all kind of mixed in with each other. So cities were not the greatest places to live in during this time period. African Americans are free in the North, but not all equal. It's kind of cutting it off down there. They weren't a huge percent of the overall population of many of the states. The highest state in the North that had the biggest percent of African American population is going to be 2.26% in Rhode Island. You can see most of these states, however, have ended slavery with laws and things like that in the 1700s. Some of them still kind of practiced it in some way, shape, or form, or allowed people from the South to bring their slaves up and things like that. But for the most part, African Americans are free. Many African Americans in places did not have the right to vote. Many could not own property. In some states, they could do both, but not in every state. So African Americans were for the most part all free in the North, but definitely did not have equal rights. Definitely did not have an equal opportunity as white Americans in the same place. Society of the South. All right, number one, it's rigid. What does that mean? Uh, just like something is rigid, right? That you can't get through it. You can't change it. It's inflexible. It is very difficult to move up. All right, if you were a poor dirt farmer and you had children, they were most likely going to be poor dirt farmers. If you were born into a plantation family, your kids were most likely going to benefit from that economically, socially, and politically. There wasn't a lot of people moving up the ladder. Not saying that nobody did, but it was very, very difficult. Um, the social pyramid had the plantation owners at the top, but again, the top of the pyramid, the most people or the least amount of people, but they had the most power. So you can see the people at the top were the people. 8% owned four, and this goes back to the other chart we talked about. 8% of the population owned five or more slaves. All right, so that's including somebody who owns five and somebody who includes 5,000. So not a lot of people owned. Majority of people did not own slaves. Most whites who did not own any slaves whatsoever were kind of the middle to the poor folks. There was some free African Americans in the South, not a huge number at 2%. And then in throughout the South, the slaves were about 32% of the overall population, but in some states, the number of slaves was actually higher than the white population in slaves like South Carolina, Alabama, where they had large slave populations. Wealthy plantation owners are going to dominate the Southern economy and politics. All right, they had the means, they had the way to get involved in politics, and they felt that they needed to be able to protect their way of life. You can the classic look of the plantation house, the big Greek columns and things like that. You had a plantation house. These large enough plantations were like a kind of a town in and of itself. There was slave quarters, there was all the fields and things like that. They were pretty much self-sufficient, producing most of the stuff that they needed, and then buying the stuff that they didn't, using the money they had for cotton and things like that. But the plantations that did exist that were large were very large indeed. Some as big. If you went on the New York City trip and went into Manhattan, there were some plantations as large as the island of Manhattan. It was a very, very big, very, very large, but there wasn't many of them. Somebody who was wealthy in the South owned land and owned slaves. A majority of those folks. There wasn't too many people who were Southern business people or who are rich Southerners who did not own a lot of slaves. And you can look kind of down there at the bottom, you see those bright red areas are folks who are where there was 50% more of the actual population were slaves. And you can kind of see that area that we talked about, Georgia into Tennessee, South Carolina, Alabama. You can kind of piece together why the Trail of Tears happened. That was a lot of the land that they wanted was going to be turned over to plantation owners to farm cotton on those plantations. So wealth in the South was you owned a bunch of land, you owned a bunch of slaves. Looking at this again, most white families kind of work their own land. If we look at that, there's about 50 working their own land per se was about 60% of the population or more. Um, and those numbers, it could be owning anywhere from 5 to 10 acres of land to thousands of acres of land. Um, but there was a pride of ownership. There was a pride of working the land. Almost 100% growing cash crops to make a living and to then use that to eke out an economic living. Most blacks in the South were slaves. Some were free workers. You can kind of look at the chart. If you look 1790 to 1860, you know, anywhere from 7 to 13% of the slave population is free in any of those areas. And now some of you may say, well, you just said like 50% of the South had slaves in some areas. Why did that number never get over 18, 19? This is the whole U.S. population. This just isn't the South. All right. So you look at that number and you can say, okay, let's look back at the numbers from the North. They were right around 10 or so percent. So there's a small number of free blacks in the South. Virtually no rights whatsoever, rights to property, rights to vote and things like that. But this is just kind of showing you, and then you can kind of see 1870 after the Civil War, there's going to be there's going to be no more slavery. So 100% of the slaves were free at that point. All right, that's going to finish up our flip lesson for today. If you have any questions, as always, hit me up on Schoology, post a message on the update boards, and we'll get to you as soon as possible. All right, till then, air it out.